right? Another way of separating out, the people, the haves from the have-nots, only in this case it would be about knowledge. The knows and the know-nots, as it were, okay? Now this is where teaching comes in. Teaching is a foil to this. Teaching engages in creative destruction of research understood as social capital. Now creative destruction is a phrase that was coined by Joseph Schumpeter, who was the economist who lived in the first half of the 20th century, wrote a very famous book, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. He is also the great theorist of entrepreneurship, which is where the concept of creative destruction comes from. And the idea, the reason why entrepreneurship is called creative destruction, which is a sort of paradoxical name, is that basically what Schumpeter was arguing was that the way in which capitalism revitalized itself, because there was always this tendency in capitalism for wealth to be monopolized. So how did capitalism, as it were, become a free market again, given the tendency of wealth to monopolize, which is something that we see today, of course? Well, he was concerned with that issue as well. And the idea is that entrepreneurs basically think about alternative ways of achieving the same ends that takes away the initial advantage that the dominant producer has. Okay? So what this means now, teaching works in a similar way. Because you imagine, let's say you have a piece of research that at the moment is only known to the people who are working in a certain kind of research area. So the way in which that knowledge is typically produced is in terms of peer-reviewed journal articles, academic conferences, where, as it were, the entry costs for getting access to that knowledge is very high. Right? You already need to know a lot in order to find out what the latest thing is. Okay? Now, what teaching is designed to do is to get rid of those entry costs, right? To break down those barriers and thereby to reduce whatever initial advantage those people had who produced the knowledge, because now you're making it accessible to larger numbers of people who otherwise would not have access to it. So what you're doing, like the entrepreneur, is you're coming up with alternative, you might say, epistemically cheaper ways of getting access to the same knowledge that was gotten by rather expensive means by the original producers of the knowledge. So the original producers of the knowledge needed to have PhDs in certain subjects, they needed to have money backing them, they needed to be able to work for a long time to produce the knowledge they did. Very expensive way of doing it. But what if you come up with a cheaper way of getting access to the same thing? This is what teaching essentially does. It makes it accessible to people who were not involved in the production of the knowledge, and moreover, as a result, it makes the knowledge available to a wider number of people who may take that knowledge in quite different directions. Okay? And that's very important. So this is where the creative destruction, teaching is a creative destruction exercise. Okay? And that's why, and you know, it's at that point, it's when you move from the research to the teaching phase, when you translate the research into the teaching, that you actually manufacture knowledge as a public good. It's at that point. So it's as the research gets translated into the teaching that the public good character of knowledge takes place. And then it properly becomes science in one of the senses that I was talking about earlier. Okay. And only universities are alone in being institutions that are dedicated to this twofold process of producing knowledge and distributing it through teaching. And so the two things need to remain integrated together in a single organization. And I say this because this is a very important ground on which to defend the university. How much more time do I have, would you say?
25 minutes.
Okay. Now you may want to ask questions about all those kinds of things. I'm going to put a few more things on the table as well. Okay. And here what I'm going to talk about is a sense of what it means to democratize science that is more connected directly to, you might say, the business of how science is embodied in people. Okay? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move toward a different sense of democratization of science, where science in some sense gets integrated into the way in which people live their lives. okay? I have a book that came out now maybe a couple of months ago called Science, the Art of Living. And it's basically about how does one think of science as something that's part of one's way of living. There are some interesting precedents for thinking about this matter. And they come from the 19th century. And what I want to do is to review these, not necessarily because I want to endorse one of them. I actually think all of them have a lot of value to them, to be honest. But I think one of the advantages of going back to the 19th century is that is really the point at which the natural sciences as a whole really start to become integrated into the major forms of institutional reproduction in society, and especially higher education. Okay, and so there is this issue about exactly what it is that we want, you know, from science that we want as part of our person, right? You know, so and this is very caught up with a question that I think remains very much with us today, such as the extent to which science, in some sense, replaces or is a religion, for example, in terms as a guide to living. Okay. Now I'm going to talk about three people briefly, each of them representing a different national tradition in which science was integrated into society in the 19th century, and really have quite different, you might say, consequences with regard to how one personally relates to science. And the first person I will start with is William Whewell. Okay, that's W-H-E-W-E-L-L. It's very strange spelling. Okay, and he was the master of Trinity College, Cambridge, in the middle third of the 19th century. And he's the person who coined the word scientist in English. And scientist, as you know, right, as the name of a profession, okay, a dedicated profession. Because of course the word science and its various cognate words have always been around, but the idea that you actually need dedicated people to pursue it for their entire lives, right, as opposed to people who do it on their spare time, right, the idea you need a scientist, right, this is Whewell's invention. And Whewell was doing this as part of a campaign, a successful campaign, to get the natural sciences integrated into the teaching at Oxford and Cambridge, which of course had this very strong humanistic bias and weren't allowing laboratories to be built on their campuses and things like that. Okay? So Whewell is both a theologian and a scientist. He's both of these things at once. And he is the person who basically comes up with the kind of image that I think you see very strongly represented, let's say, in Thomas Kuhn's theory of science. That scientists labor under a paradigm, right? And the paradigm is this kind of master theory where everybody is kind of an under-laborer working to fill in the details of it, right? If you remember Kuhn's view of science. Well, Whewell originates this view and also originates the exemplar of this view, which Kuhn borrows as well, which is Newton, right? If you want to know what is, you know, the best case scenario for Kuhn's model of science would be something like Newtonian mechanics, and Whewell comes up with this idea. And what Whewell basically believed was that, in a way, science was a democratically organized society amongst itself in sort of the way that a monastic order is, right? Where everybody is equally subordinated to the same ideal. And the same ideal is not just an ideal of truth, but is a certain kind of worldview, as it were, that the science is promoting at a given moment, what we would call the paradigm, right? So the Newtonian mechanics, right, isn't just a set of equations or even a set of, you know, ways of solving problems with those equations, but it's also a certain kind of theoretical orientation to the world, which in principle can encompass everything, okay? And everybody who works in science is equally subordinated to that worldview, okay? And Newton himself talked about standing on the shoulders of giants, right, and all this, right? Everybody's kind of